Hi, if you're just coming across my profile, then I am Christine and I've been asked about whether I can do some resources for GCSE biology. So I'm going to focus on AQA, and this is to help you for your paper 1 prep. So I want to look at aerobic respiration. Now you should know that your mitochondria is the site of aerobic respiration. And what does aerobic actually mean? Well, aerobic respiration means in the presence of oxygen. So the equation that you should know is that glucose plus oxygen is going to react together and create products which are water and carbon dioxide. So our reactants for aerobic respiration are glucose and oxygen, and our products are water and carbon dioxide. Now, if you're a higher level student, you should know how to write the chemical symbol equation along with balancing it. So the key thing to know is that glucose, chemical formula is C6H12O6. Oxygen is O2. Now, to balance the equation, remember your sixes. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 will react to produce 6 water molecules, H2O, and 6 carbon dioxide molecules. Now, this is an exothermic reaction. And the reason it's called an exothermic reaction is because it transfers energy that was stored inside the bonds of the glucose and the oxygen to the environment. So the energy gets transferred from the chemical energy form. Here's a bit of physics for you. It is going to be transferred to thermal energy, which is then lost to the environment. So this is a chemical reaction that is occurring where we are bringing together glucose and oxygen and releasing the energy and producing our water and carbon dioxide as the products. So how do we actually get the oxygen for aerobic respiration? Well, to get the oxygen, we need to take a look at our airways. So the first thing we need to note is that our mouth and our nasal cavity are openings that are going to allow air to come into our lungs. We will then make our way down our trachea, then that is remaining open because of cartilage rings. So the trachea is an open tube which allows air to come down through into our bronchi. Now, if it is singular, it's bronchus. If it's plural, it's bronchi. We then move on to our alveoli. Now, there are bronchioles in there, but you don't need to name them. You just need to know the mouth and nasal cavity to the trachea to the bronchi to the alveoli. You will learn about that more if you go on to A level, but for your exam, they only want you to go to the bronchi. So then let's look at the alveoli then. So the alveoli have a large surface area. And the reason they've got a large surface area is because they are lots of these, what I like to call a bit like broccoli ends to our lungs. Now, the alveoli is the site of gaseous exchange. So if we look at an alveolus, what we can see is that it is very small and very thin, and therefore there is a short diffusion distance. We have a thin alveolus wall, meaning that that diffusion, the transfer of a molecule from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, diffusion, that diffusion distance is very short. Now, gases are going to be exchanged here. That's why it's called the site of gaseous exchange. Gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to diffuse down their concentration gradient. So the high oxygen concentration will diffuse, the molecule will diffuse into the blood capillary down its concentration gradient. With regards to carbon dioxide, it will also diffuse from where it's at a higher concentration in the blood capillary to where there's a lower concentration in the alveolus. But how do we guarantee that? Well, we guarantee that by using our ribs, our intercostal muscles, and our diaphragm. What we do is we ventilate our lungs to ensure that there is a concentration gradient being maintained. But how do we do that? Well, we do this as well by ensuring that we have this rich supply of blood. So our blood capillaries are all over, encompassing our alveoli, and the blood is being pumped by the heart, and that therefore is going to maintain a concentration gradient. So let's just look at how the lungs ventilate then, because if you are a higher candidate, you will be expected to understand that as the rib cage goes up and down, what we're actually doing is we are changing the volume. So when we inhale, our ribs are moving up and out. Our diaphragm is flattening. Therefore, the volume inside our pleural cavity, our lung cavity, is increasing. The pressure is then decreasing lower than the atmospheric pressure, so air is going to come into our lungs. When we are exhaling, we are breathing out, our ribs are going to fall down and in. Our diaphragm is going to move back up. The volume therefore has decreased. The pressure has increased. The air is going to flow out. So to ensure that we have this concentration gradient so that the oxygen is always diffusing into the blood and that the carbon dioxide is always diffusing out into the alveolus, we need to be ventilating our system, and that is through the movement of our rib cage. So let's just look at the heart then, because obviously we also need this rich blood supply. We need this pumping of the blood. So if we were to look at the heart and we were to split it down into its two sides, so I always like to imagine it a bit like a box, and I then cut it in half down the middle. What I then note is on the left side, so imagine this picture, you picking it up and putting it against your chest. That's how you determine which side is the left side. So I use the alphabet to help me to remember this. The left side, A to L. We have got our left atrium. We have a valve. You are GCSE, so you just need to know that it's a valve. And we have our left ventricle. Therefore, the blood should flow from our left atrium to our left ventricle, and it will then flow out of the aorta. They are A to L. So we have the left atrium to the left ventricle to the aorta. The valves are present to prevent the blood from flowing backwards. So to ensure that the blood is always going from the left atrium into the left ventricle, it will need to be stopped from going backwards. There is a valve present. Going from the aorta, we want the left ventricle, the blood to flow from the left ventricle to the aorta. We don't want it to fall backwards. We have valves present to stop the blood flowing backwards. So therefore, we know that on the left side, we have our left atrium, our left ventricle and our aorta. Now the pulmonary vein doesn't actually follow suit with my rule of the alphabet, but I'll show you how it makes sense on the other side. My right side is my M to Z. So the right side, we have our vena cava. This is the biggest vein that is going to lead in to my right atrium. So the blood is going to flow from the body into the right atrium via the vena cava. The blood will then flow from the right atrium across the valve to the right ventricle, and it will then flow up to the pulmonary artery. So vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery. I always remember that my arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. My veins are carrying blood into the heart. So the pulmonary artery is where I go first. That is on the right side, taking blood away from the heart to the lungs. Therefore, my pulmonary vein is bringing the blood flow back to the left side. After that oxygenated blood, the oxygen has been picked up by my blood cells, so I now have oxygenated blood coming in to my left atrium. So during exercise, when you are wanting to ensure that you are able to sustain the exercise, what's going to happen is your heart rate is going to increase, your breathing rate is going to increase, and your breath volume is going to increase. Why is that the case? Well, remember, respiration, we're linking this to bioenergetics, to respiration, we needed oxygen and glucose for aerobic respiration to occur. So to supply enough glucose and enough oxygen, the heart rate which pumps the blood around, the breathing rate, which ensures that there is the gaseous exchange at the lungs, needs to be increased. That's going to help deliver that oxygen and glucose for aerobic respiration faster. But remember, aerobic respiration, we had some products. We had carbon dioxide. This is a waste product, which is not good in the body. It makes our blood too acidic. We need to remove it quickly. So therefore, during exercise, the increased heart rate, the increased breathing rate and breath rate, they are to supply the oxygen and glucose. Do not lose a marking point, because you forget that glucose is needed for respiration and also for the removal of the carbon dioxide. The other thing to know is if that glucose is needed, where did it come from? And this is where the stored glycogen in your muscles and your liver cells can actually be converted into glucose. This is going to increase that supply of the glucose for respiration. So what happens if we don't get the oxygen? What happens in the absence of oxygen? Well, this is where we do anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration is the release of a small amount of energy, 2 ATP molecules, whereas aerobic respiration is between 36 to 38 ATP molecules, through the incomplete oxidation of glucose in the absence of oxygen. So glucose can be broken down, but incompletely, in animals, in plants, and in yeast. But it's done in a different way. So if we look at the animal side of things, animals, we've got glucose. We are going to incompletely oxidize that glucose. There's no oxygen present. We're going to create lactic acid. So we're going to convert the glucose into lactic acid. That is toxic in high quantities. So therefore, we need to turn that into a less toxic substance. We're going to convert it back to carbon dioxide and water. But to do that, we need to transport the lactic acid that has been building up to the liver. And what we also need to do is we need to repay what's known as the oxygen debt. So the oxygen that is required to complete the oxidation, to break the lactic acid down into carbon dioxide and water, needs to be repaid. So you can only do anaerobic respiration for a very short amount of time. It provides a small amount of energy being released, but you need to repay that oxygen so that you can break the lactic acid down in the liver. Now, plants and yeast are able to do anaerobic respiration so that they can release a small amount of energy, but they do it slightly differently in the fact that when they do anaerobic respiration, they will produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, alcohol, when we look at using yeast, for example, if you ever want to look at what's known as fermentation, you can do anaerobic respiration using yeast to produce alcoholic drinks. So because we know that yeast, when they anaerobically respire, will break glucose down through the process of incomplete oxidation and produce alcohol, we can utilize that when we want to make alcoholic drinks. On the other hand, if we want to bake bread, we utilize the fact that yeast will do incomplete oxidation, anaerobic respiration, and they produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to be a gas that's released, which causes our bread to rise. So if we are proofing our bread, when we're making our bread and our dough, what we will do is we cover it with cling film. Once the oxygen has been removed, then what will happen is the anaerobic respiration can still occur. We're still producing carbon dioxide. It will keep rising, but then it's producing alcohol. So why is that not a problem? Well, we bake bread. So when we bake the bread, what that does is that evaporates off the alcohol that was produced through the fermentation by the yeast. So it is important you note aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen, anaerobic respiration in the absence of oxygen, and the difference between whether it's in an animal or whether it's plants and yeast. So what type of question could they ask you? Well, it could be this: describe two differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration in humans, 2 marks. Do not refer to oxygen in your answer. So in this case, they want you to be able to tell them, well, aerobic respiration releases lots of energy, whereas anaerobic respiration releases less energy. Aerobic respiration produces water as a product of the chemical reaction, whereas anaerobic respiration does not. Aerobic respiration produces lactic acid. No, it doesn't. It does not produce lactic acid. Anaerobic respiration does. So it's really important that when you are answering the questions that you're stating, this one has this, whereas that one has that, because that is the point that they're assessing. The other thing to note is I just said lactic acid was produced with aerobic respiration, but I meant to say anaerobic respiration. And you'll be surprised how many times in the exam you will do that. You'll write the wrong answer thinking that you are meaning to say anaerobic respiration, but you've actually written aerobic respiration. So do take the time to assess your written work and double check you've written it the way you want to.